Welcome everyone to today's Repair lecture. Thank you very much for coming. The Repair lectures are an interdisciplinary lecture series that focuses on reparations demands and policies around the world. They're hosted by the Anthropology Department at the University of Amsterdam, funded by the European Research Council, and supported by the University Center of Conflict Studies. And today we have the great pleasure of having not one but two short lectures on the topic of Wassenaar 1952 and the global politics of repair. And today's event should be fascinating to anyone interested in reparations because it will teach us about the first ever reparations negotiation in the aftermath of genocide and crimes against humanity. These are more specifically negotiations over German reparations after World War II, which were in many ways groundbreaking and paradigmatic for the global wave of reparations that we have seen since. Together, the lectures will last around 45 minutes and they will be recorded. And afterwards, we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A, which will not be recorded. So please feel free to ask whatever question comes to mind. And if you would like to ask a question, please post it in the chat if you're online, or for the people in the room, please queue at one of the two microphones that are available, either here in the front or with Musumi, so that the people online can hear you. And to introduce today's speakers, it's a great honor for us to welcome Lorena de Vita with us here in the room today. Lorena is Associate Professor in the History of International Relations at Utrecht. Her work focuses on the international histories of reconciliation and repair, and she authored the book entitled Israelpolitik, German-Israeli Relations from 1949 until 1969, published with Manchester United Press in 2020. She also currently leads a research project on the private diaries of lifelong reparations activist Otto Küster. And one of the main questions that Lorena's research tries to answer is how to break the cycles of violent conflict and how to enable dialogue and processes of reconciliation. Then our second speaker is Constantin Goschler, Professor of Contemporary History at Ruhr-Universität Bochum. Professor Goschler is one of the world's leading experts on the history of restitution and reparations in Germany after World War II, especially in relation to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Among the many books he published, two recent ones might be particularly interesting for our audience today, and these are Historical Dialogue and the Prevention of Mass Atrocities, co-edited and published with Taylor and Francis in 2020. And then there is Compensation in Practice, the Foundation, Rembrandt's Responsibility in Future, and the Legacy of Forced Labor During the Third Reich, published with Berkhan in 2017. And on these introductory remarks, I hand over to Lorena.
Thank you very much. So thanks very much, everyone, for the invitation, of course, to present this recently published edited volume. This is in some way a shared lecture. I'm very happy that Constantin Goschler can also join us, so we will be both discussing the book, which is indeed, as you can see on the slide, Redefining Reparations, Wassenaar 1952 and the Global Politics of Repair. I'm going to start in a moment to discuss the book more closely, but I first want to mention that this is a book, as we will explain also in more detail in the next few minutes, that has a host of different contributors. And we decided for today, rather than going in detail about each chapter, the idea is to give you a sense of why we very much wanted to have the kind of scholarly conversation that is taking place in this book, what the aim of this publication is, and which kind of dialogue we would like to have, not just between historians that coincidentally myself and Constantin are, but also, and very importantly, with colleagues who are working in other fields. And these other fields are also represented in the volume, including anthropology, sociology, legal history more specifically, and transitional justice, for example. We also have rhetoric and other points of focus. But so what is the book about, and what do we talk about when we talk about Wassenaar 1952, what is this global politics of repair? Now, I, as a good historian, want to start by bringing you in the, let's say, in the middle of the events. And a very important starting point for this is an agreement which was signed not in Wassenaar, but in Luxembourg on the 10th of September, 1952. This was an agreement which was signed, you can see on the, I think on your right-hand side by the Federal Chancellor Adenauer, on the other side by then Israeli Foreign Minister Moshe Sharett, and to his left there are also representatives of the Jewish Claims Conference that are sitting. Namely, this was an important agreement. By signing this, Germany committed to paying Israel a total of 3 billion German marks over the next 12 years, as well as 450 million to the Claims Conference. We will be discussing the agreement in more detail in the next minutes, but this is an important starting point. September 1952, the signing of this agreement, and as you can see on the slide, the core of what had been just negotiated about or signed an agreement about was referred to in different ways by the negotiating parties. In German, the word used also today to refer back to those negotiations, the agreement, is Wiedergutmachung, which is a word that has is composed by three parts that reveal an ambition to literally make good again. In Hebrew, shilomim does not have this kind of connotation. And this is just one small example, perhaps, that deals with languages, but in fact also goes to the core of what had been just negotiated about, what was the agreement about. So our argument in a nutshell is that the argument of this volume, despite the different contributions, is that the negotiations which took place before this agreement was signed, and which not many people know took place in the Netherlands, in Wassenaar, fundamentally altered discourse, norms, and practices concerning reparations for mass crimes. At the same time, the book also recognizes something very important, namely that those negotiations were not conducted with the goal of setting a precedent for how other states or groups, victimized groups, could pursue justice. So we also very much want to avoid a teleological reading of what happened, while at the same time recognizing the importance of those events. The book is structured along three main parts that thematize questions pertaining to who was involved, questions of actorness, agency, who was involved or not in those talks, but also issues relating to practices and meanings, legacy of repair, as well as something which is quite visible in the news, namely different echoes and resonances or referrals back to that historical example, also in very different contexts and cases. Now, in terms of the importance of these agreements, you saw the person that I have on this slide, Ben Ferenc. He was also in the previous one. He was the youngest person at that table, someone who had been the youngest prosecutor at the Nuremberg successor trials, and who then in that instance decided to stay in Germany, become involved in questions pertaining restitution, and someone whose work Constantin knows very well, has also published and curated a vast selection of Ben Ferenc's archives. Just to use Ben Ferenc's words, when he wrote about these 1952 negotiations, he wrote, and I quote, that the Federal Republic of Germany, by signing the agreement, by sitting with the negotiators from the Israeli and Claims Conference side, has established a milestone in international morality. And this question of the milestone is an interesting one, because for sure, those negotiations seem to have an echo, or that precedent, as it were, seems to have an echo also in current debates. To mention some of these examples, this is a piece which was published in 2014 on The Atlantic by US intellectual and activist Ta-Nehisi Coates, in which he was writing about reparations in the context of the United States in the aftermath of slavery. And it's a long piece, which also later featured in his edited collection. But just to give you a sense of these references, and I quote, "In 1952, when West Germany began the process of making amends for the Holocaust, it did so under conditions that should be instructive to us. Resistance was violent. Very few Germans believed that Jews were entitled to anything. Only 5% of West Germans surveyed reported feeling guilty about the Holocaust, and only 29% believed that Jews were owed restitution from the German people." This is not just one reference in passing. In fact, this is a case which is referred to in the context of the United States. Just to give you a different example, you can also find it in the work of Susan Neiman in her Learning from the Germans, Confronting Race and the Memory of Evil. But there is also some very different notions of referral to this precedent. In some way, this was a reference to, as it were, a precedent-setting case from a positive perspective. But the case is not just reference to when discussing the aftermath of slavery. Also in discussions pertaining the aftermath of colonialism, questions of this precedent appeared as well. Groups arguing for reparations for the descendants of Ova, Herero and Nama people exterminated between 1904 and 1908 in what was then German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, also drew a connection between their quest for reparations and the negotiations held in Wassenaar between West Germany, Israel, and the Claims Conference, but in order to express a different kind of point. Just to go a little bit back in time, in 2021, after months of talks with Namibian counterparts, officials of the Federal Republic recognized the violence perpetrated in then German Southwest Africa as a genocide. On that occasion, the federal government asked, and I quote, Namibia and the descendants of the victims for forgiveness, offering to pay 1.1 billion euros to finance, and I quote again, reconstruction and development projects. This announcement was met with outrage from representatives of the Ova, Herero and Nama communities, who countered that they did not recognize the process as having been fair, given that they had not been included in the negotiations. Just to give you an example, I'm going to quote from an interview released by the Deputy Minister of Health and Social Services in Namibia, Esther Munjangwe, who said, as long as this was after these 2021 events, as long as Germany avoids using words such as genocide and reparation, we can forget about coming closer to closing this chapter. We need to go back to the drawing board, level the playing field, identify stakeholders, clear terminology, because you don't want to be in the middle of negotiations and still not know whether this is a negotiation for genocide or past dark history, reparation, development aid. It is critical to have representatives of the communities at the negotiating table, selected and appointed by themselves. It is simple. We follow the same model that was applied in 1952, to cut it short, but you have the full quote also on the slides. As historians familiar with the events of 1952, reading the news coming from contexts as diverse as Namibia and the United States, we were struck by the vastly different references to the same historical event across different times and places. So one of the questions that we were posing ourselves was, did and do these Wassenaar talks constitute a relevant precedent for other groups claiming reparations in the aftermath of mass victimization? So today we want to give you a sense of the context of this book, the content, some of the puzzles that we're dealing with as well. In terms of the context, materially, physically, this is where the negotiations took place, in this old Oud-kasteel in Wassenaar. But it's not just to bring you there, as it were, back in time. It is also to give you a sense of how these talks are usually situated within the literature. And it is very much a multidisciplinary literature, because these negotiations are referred to also in different ways by different scholars. We have, for example, one of the pioneer historians who worked on the case, Nana Sagi, who wrote of this negotiation bringing about a total innovation. John Torpy, who wrote about the reparations as crafting the prototype of all reparation politics. We also have, just as an example, MIT political scientist Melissa Nobles, who wrote in her work on political apologies, and I quote, "German reparations after World War II to the State of Israel and surviving Jews are probably the most well-known and serve in their wake as an exemplar of successful reparations." The examples continue. So in IR, I have here Todd Hall, who wrote a very important book about the use of political emotions in politics, including diplomatic negotiations, or scholars such as Elazar Barkan, who used the case to reflect about reparations as negotiated history, what he called the Faustian predicament back then. So the context in terms of the literature is quite varied. And in terms of what we wanted to do was also to zoom out, because what we saw were different strands of literature not quite being in dialogue with each other, even though there were and there are clearly some important points of connection there. This is why I decided to organize both a public event and a workshop at the KNAV in 2022. This was part of a KNAV early career partnership grant, and then later the book came about thanks to the support of the University of Bochum, as well as Utrecht, and a broader set also of authors, interlocutors as well. And the idea was to reflect again, and in this dialogical way, about these reparations negotiation. So we decided to title, together with Constantin, who edited the volume with me, we decided to put Wassenaar really also in the title of the book, but also in a symbolic way. So on the one hand, of course, Wassenaar is the place in which these negotiations took place, but it also means for us something quite different. The first one is also a way to remind ourselves and our students, readers, that these negotiations that are often referred to as this successful case, in fact, were very vulnerable. And the idea that they would become this precedent was absolutely uncertain at that time. So they were vulnerable, they were open-ended as well, these talks. Perhaps not many people know that there were also terrorist attacks, both against the negotiators in the Netherlands, but also against the German chancellor, so with the parcel bombs sent to Munich. And here you can find some documents that I found in the Dutch, both municipal archive of The Hague, but also the National Archives. So the idea is that indeed those talks were vulnerable. There was also a lot of resistance against them. And as the Israeli head of the negotiation, Yosef Dahl, put it in a letter to his wife, which he wrote after the first week of the negotiations, and I quote, "There is no way of knowing what will result from this." In order to give you a deeper sense of the book and its message, I want to pass on the word to my colleague, Professor Constantin Goschler.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorena. So I want to continue with trying to explain what was innovative about Wassenaar. Wassenaar also as a symbol for redefining reparations. So there are several aspects which one might keep in mind. So the first thing is that all preceding reparations, basically from the time of World War I, had addressed the damages caused by war exclusively. A second aspect was that in Wassenaar, the representatives of two countries were meeting for negotiations, which had not existed at the time of the atrocities or the war that had taken place before. So Germany was a new state, and Israel hadn't existed at the time of the atrocities. So this was really something very new. A third aspect was that these reparations compensated very distinct categories of Jewish Nazi victims. So on the one hand, there were victims of the Holocaust, which at that time were living in Israel, and on the other hand, there were members of the Jewish diaspora, which made the issue quite complicated because you had to bring these groups and their claims together within the negotiations. A fourth aspect was that these negotiations not only included states, but for probably the first time in history, a non-governmental organization, so the Jewish Claims Conference. And this is one of the aspects which has become especially interesting for more recent reparation claims, because this brings the question into play: how might it be possible to bring forward claims beyond of states, which traditionally have been the exclusive actors within international affairs? And a last aspect which has made Wassenaar very specific and also a point of debate for a long time is that the question of politics and morality. So in Wassenaar, Germany and Israel and the Claims Conference met without an existing binding legal responsibility. So in a way, there was a mixture between a political necessity and a complicated kind of morality. And this leads to one of the core questions: how to analyze and how to interpret Wassenaar. And this of course is also one of the main issues which are important for further reparations claims from different contexts. So next slide, please. The next slide would be slide 14, please. Okay, and to sum up, now you need to go. Okay, here we are. That's correct. Okay, there. As a result of the negotiations in Wassenaar, there were developed three broad categories of measures. So a first category was compensation for the state of Israel, and it was not, and that's important, officially for the murder of Jews, but it was explained as a compensation for the cost of settling survivors of the Shoah who had emigrated to Palestine, Israel. This was a result that Israel wanted to avoid that the payments might be considered as blood money. So they tried to avoid from this reproach by telling, well, it's not for the murdering of people, it's just for the integration of refugees. A second aspect was that there was some funding for the reestablishment of Jewish communities outside of Israel. So this was the particular interest of the Jewish Claims Conference. So this was, so to speak, the diaspora aspect. And there was also always a tension between Israel, so this was the Zionist concept of reparation, and the diaspora, so Jews outside of Israel. And somehow they managed to bridge this tension, which was an important question in its own. And thirdly, there was another aspect as a result of the Wassenaar negotiations. There was a German commitment to legal improvements of individual compensation for physical and material damage during the time of the Nazi persecution. So it's interesting to know, at that time, there was no speaking of suffering. So we are very much used to speak about suffering, at least. This has been the case since the 1980s, when the reparation discourse somehow shifted from damage to suffering. But one might think, and we might discuss this later on, that in the meantime, damage has become again a more important category. But it's always important to keep in mind how we conceptualize the events for which there are any reparation claims. Okay, next slide, please. So I will speak a little bit about the content of our book, and I will speak about aims and outlines, and Lorena will also proceed with some thoughts about the questions which arise out of our book. So next slide, please. Okay, what is the aim of our book? And you can see this beautiful Venn diagram, and there are two aspects: historical context, past and present, and multidisciplinarity. So first, the historical context. We've been trying to go beyond the traditional focus on German-Israeli Jewish relations, which so far mostly has informed research on Wassenaar and the Luxembourg Agreement. So we have tried to put Wassenaar into the historical context of the afterlife of World War II and also of the Holocaust in a global perspective. And furthermore, it was important for us to consider the context of the history of the Cold War and also the context of the history of decolonization, which broadens the picture very much. Referring to past and present, we have been interested in the question, what were the effects of Wassenaar for other reparation claims for state atrocities? So we are interested in Wassenaar not only as a historical event in itself, but also in Wassenaar as a point of reference, as a model in a positive or maybe also in a negative sense. And Lorena already mentioned an important question, which was, so to speak, the red thread of our book. Was Wassenaar, or has Wassenaar been a precedence for other cases of restitution, or has it rather been a precedence without successor? And so between these two positions, we have somehow been shifting back and forth. And Lorena has also already mentioned some findings of our book, which might lead to a more positive answer, while of course there are also cases which might lead into a different direction. And finally, with respect to multidisciplinarity, Lorena already mentioned that there are contributors from the field of history, from social sciences, political sciences, anthropology, and so on. And I just would like to add, it's not only about multidisciplinarity, it's also about intergenerationality. So as you can see, we are two editors from in a different stage of our careers, and this is important insofar because every generation brings its own question to the topic. And so this has been a very important and a very fruitful part of our work to bringing together different questions, not only from different disciplines, but also from different generation. And time has been an important element, or temporality, an important element of our work for this book, which all in all took about 3 years. And even in these 3 years, the world has changed very much, and all these changes have constantly influenced our work. So in a way, it has been a work in progress. At some point, you need to stop, otherwise the authors will run away. And so we had to print the book. But certainly this will not be the end of the discussion. And maybe and hopefully we will start the discussion after our presentation. So ultimately, some words to the structure of the book. Our book is structured along 3 paths. So the first path refers to question pertaining to the actors involved or not involved in the talks and their respective agency and subjectivity. The second part refers to issues relating to the meanings and practices of repair over the course of the 20th century. Thirdly, so the third part refers to echoes and resonances of Wassenaar across times, places, and cultures. And you can already see a short outline of the first part of our book, which I will briefly comment. So as already mentioned, the first part relates to questions of agency and actorness. And these categories are integral to the redefinition of reparation. So our questions in this part are, who were those who took part in the negotiations in Wassenaar? And it's also important to ask who did not take part and why did they not take part? So ultimately, the question we are dealing with in this part of the book is, who is speaking in behalf of whom? And I think this is one of the core questions of if you are doing research on reparations, it's always about agency and who is speaking for whom and who is not speaking. So in our case, questions to agency not only involve the representatives of the victims, but also the representatives of the perpetrators, because there's the same problem on the side of the perpetrators. Who should be speaking for them in case that there are any negotiations on reparations? So that's a bilateral problem which we have been addressing in our book. So Ronald Zweig shows how the various Jewish factions successfully managed to overcome their internal divisions in favor of a unique position against the Federal Republic. This was especially important given the fierce protests in Israel against negotiations in Germany. And the second author, Gideon Reuveney, shows how the state of Israel and Germany tried to make the talks possible by avoiding to bring people to the negotiation table who were considered as being personally involved in the burdensome past. So this is a totally different approach to what we have seen in recent times when bringing personally affected victims into the negotiations has become one of the major strategies. So the decision not to bring the victims to Wassenaar was also part of the transformation of an impossible negotiation from on moral into a rather technical issue, which is also an interesting aspect from a systematic perspective. So the third author, Katrin Bachleitner, underlines the role of international relations and thus tries to balance the strong focus on the heavy internal pressure on the respective governments, which existed both in Israel and Germany. And finally, Ido de Haan reflects on the reconstruction of political agency on both sides of the negotiation table in Wassenaar, emphasizing the contribution of German Wiedergutmachung for the whitewashing of Nazi-tainted West German elites. Insofar, the echoes of the fierce protests in 1952, led under the slogan of blood money in the streets of Jerusalem, still resonate until today in the literature. And there are many more examples. Think about the book of Daniel Marwetsky and so on. So this still is a very strong slogan. And in my view, this needs to be put into a historical perspective, because somehow an old debate becomes warmed up again and again. So we'll speak a little bit about the second part of the volume, which focuses on the shared and divergent meanings and practices pertaining to reparations measures. The contributors of this part grapple with the question of how the developments in Wassenaar related to practices concerning restitution, reparation, and indemnification, which existed at that time and which have developed since. Linda Kinstler illustrates the fundamental changes that occurred in the reparative imagination in the interwar era. So it's basically about the question, what were the expectations? What should be the outcome of reparations? So should it rather be future-oriented, or should it rather, as Linda Kinstler argues, bring about a better version of the past? So this is also one of the core questions of any attempt for reparations. The next author, Wouter Vera, questions the extent to which the Wassenaar negotiations interacted with developments in the sphere of restitution in Western Europe, namely in the Netherlands. Luke Moffat, who is the third author in this part of the book, examines the relevance of Wassenaar in order to reflect on contemporary obstacles to implement reparations in post-conflict settings from a transitional justice perspective. Susan Sliomovich finally offers in a fascinating autoethnographically informed account of 3 generations of women, where she deals with the dilemma of whether or not to file for compensation. So she describes how this changed over times, and this is also a really fascinating chapter. So I will come to the third part of the book, which focuses on the numerous echoes and resonances of Wassenaar across generations, countries, scholarly fields, and reparations-related debates up to the present day. This part engages with other events and groups that have in different ways pointed to the German Jewish-Israeli reparations, albeit referring to the aftermath of conflict, colonial genocidal violence, expulsion, and slavery. The first author in this part is Nicole Imler, and she questions the very idea of Germany having set a standard or model for reparation practices at all. She does so both by drawing on extensive oral history interviews with Holocaust survivors and by reflecting on contemporary debates in the fields of transitional justice and post-colonial studies. So this is one of the examples where you can see how post-colonial studies gradually have changed, have shifted the field of reparations. And there's a very strong impact from post-colonial studies generally in this field, and I think it will still go on and will intensify. So it's also important to debate these issues. One of the examples which most people will quickly come to mind when it comes to a post-colonial perspective on Wassenaar is dealt with by Michael Fischbach, who studies the history of the Arab attempts to oppose the 1952 Wassenaar negotiations. And of course, the events in Israel and Gaza have evolved in the background of the making of our book, and you might imagine that it's quite complicated to get together, to keep together the different positions among the authors in such tense political environment. So this has been one of our major challenges, but it has also been an element of very fruitful discussions among us. So politics do have an effect on what we are doing as scholars, not only in these times, but I think this is one of the topics where politics and scholarly research always interact in some way or other very intensely. So Michael Fischbach traces the efforts of Arab and United Nations officials taking place around the same time to make the case for reparations for Palestinian refugees of the first Arab-Israeli war. The next author, Henning Melber, also deals with a hot political topic. He analyzes the so far unsuccessful attempts to receive German reparations for the genocide which Germany committed against the Nama and Herero, and he discusses the references which in this context have been made to Wassenaar. So in this case, Wassenaar rather has showed up as a negative point of reference. So the general tendency is, why did Jews get reparations, and why do African people, why won't they get the same rights? So this is part of the discourse which emerged in the course of compensation claims from today's Namibia. So this is also a very interesting aspect of the question of Wassenaar as a precedence, or as a precedence without successor. And finally, in a more optimistic mood, Roy Brooks closes the volume by explaining why and how it is still possible and helpful to refer to the history of 1952 to understand the pivotal questions and the pivotal questions underlying the politics of repair. By doing so, Roy Brooks makes specific references to the echoes of those reparation negotiations in the debates taking place in the United States concerning reparations for African Americans. And my guess would be that recent political changes have not strengthened very much these debates. So I have so far nothing heard about immediate effects of the new Trump government on this kind of claims, but my general feeling would be that recent changes have not been very helpful to these attempts. But again, we are touching the borderline, the border between political debates and scholarly research. And having said that, I would again give the word back to Lorena.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Constantin, also for the overview. Is the camera?
The camera.
Super. In order to give some kind of conclusion, as you could hear, on the one hand, this is a very specific historical case. On the other hand, because of developments that are taking place around the world, also because of different perspectives brought about by an engagement between disciplines and dialogue between, as Constantin also mentioned, generations, disciplines, perspectives. We wanted to put together a volume that, on the one hand, would deal with this history, but on the other, would also try and investigate what kind of enduring questions that came up then somehow seem to stick with us, regardless of the time and place. For example, reparations for whom? Reparations for what purposes? To be negotiated by whom? Where? To be delivered how? These kinds of questions seem to resurface constantly, periodically, as the international legal theory and practice concerning reparations has expanded. There is also more historical scholarship coming on this. I also have a close colleague at the University of Utrecht, René Koekoek, who is working on a book that takes us way back in time, but I will not spoiler things too much. But just to mention that it's also very interesting from my perspective as a historian to see also just how much engagement there is with a topic that so far has received not as much attention as it could have. So conventional wisdom casts these 1952 negotiations as a success, and understandably so. Germany did honor its payments. It went above and beyond what it had agreed upon, and this German emphasis on confronting the past, nationally and internationally, has characterized the country's post-war history. And these, of course, served also an important goal in the context of the Cold War, as we heard. But for us, it was important to also stress that those negotiations took place in a fraught political context, one that was characterized at the local, national, transnational, and international level by very serious tensions, conflicting interpretations about how to deal with the legacy of the then very recent past. So we try to put at the forefront questions of actorness, political subjectivity, and social agency. We try to trace the legacy of history, including the transgenerational impact that these kind of decisions and discussions also had, as well as inviting scholars who work on the topic and students interested in it to reflect on also these various echoes across time and space. The idea is, of course, not to put a final word on this, but of course, the understanding is that the work and the conversations also continue with reference to the events that are unfolding now, but also, as we hope, to demonstrate by putting perhaps a more multifaceted perspective on the table. And also, maybe before closing the recording, I just want to mention that one of the contributing authors to the book, Professor Wouter Verart, is also in the room. And so that for anyone who wants specific information about this question of property rights and why and how they changed in the 50s, what the legacy is, of course, we will have a privileged perspective there, but also to thank all the contributors that Constantin also already mentioned, and that are spread both in terms of their specialties and where they work in very different parts of the world, and without whom this book would not have been possible. So on this note, thank you very much to all the contributors, and also thank you very much to Felix, Hannah, Masumi, all the whole team for making this lecture possible. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.